All right, welcome everyone to this sixth public event in UCL's Disagreeing Well series. We're going to be talking about disagreeing well on diplomacy, and we are going to have three panelists with us. The third one, she's coming in a moment. I'm going to introduce them a little bit later, but let me first say a few words about why we're here and what the purpose of these events are. Well, my name is Kristin M Bakke. I'm a professor here at UCL in political science and international relations. I've been teaching courses at UCL for 16 years on political violence and international conflict and cooperation. And one of the many things that impressed me about my students here, some of whom might be here, is their ability to talk about difficult topics in a very constructive way, to carefully listen, engage, and disagree well, even when they have very strong opinions. And this event here today is part of UCL's flagship campaign on disagreeing well, which is an initiative that's spearheaded and initiated by our president and provost, Michael Spence. And it's an initiative that is really about recognizing universities at these important spaces for discussion and debate, for disagreeing well, and thinking about tools and techniques for disagreeing well and having conversations about difficult topics. If you're interested in this campaign more generally, we have lots of resources online. There are recordings of previous events and talks online. There's reading material. There are little videos on sort of skills type videos on how do you have conversations, how you can have better conversations. So you can just search for UCL Disagreeing Well and see some of these resources. Now, we're going to be talking about disagreeing well on diplomacy. Now, it might be that over the course of the conversation, you or I or any of us hear things we might be disagreeing with. And in the spirit of disagreeing well, we ask everyone to really engage with other people's ideas, think about the viewpoints we're hearing, even if they might feel uncomfortable or challenging to us. You are going to have, you the audience, you're going to have the opportunity to be asking questions via Slido, and you'll be told later on how to do that. Because we want this event to be interactive, so you will have the chance to think about questions you might want to ask to our panelists tonight. Now, our theme for the event is disagreeing well on diplomacy. And last year, in 2024, we reached a historic high in the post-World War II era, a historic high we might not have wanted to reach. It was a historic high in terms of the number of armed conflicts, ongoing armed conflicts since World War II. 61 ongoing armed conflicts last year. It doesn't look like it's going to be any better this year. This is data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. They track conflicts across countries and over time. They also try to keep track on what are, the battle-related deaths in these conflicts. And the estimate they give is that it's at least 160,000 battle-related deaths in these conflicts last year. That is, of course, not capturing all the human suffering that is happening in the deaths that are happening outside the battlefields. They also noted a very troubling increase in violence targeting civilians. And, sadly, this is something we see reports of in the news every single day. Now, if we'd organized this event, say 10 or at least 15 years ago, the tone of the event might have been quite different. In fact, like around 2009-10, there were events on the decline of war. There were academic articles or popular science articles and books about the decline of warfare. And there was a sense of optimism, cautious optimism, but a sense of that things were moving in the right direction. That optimism has faded as the curve, the graph of armed conflict has gone steadily up in the last 10, 15 years. At the same time, we're seeing that democracy is in decline. So the number of democracies is in decline, number of non-democracies are growing, and even long-standing democracies like the United States, and some would argue like the United Kingdom, are experiencing what political scientists call democratic backsliding. In addition, and increasingly, we see political leaders, state leaders engaged in quite polarizing rhetoric, the us versus them rhetoric that is even demonizing, dehumanizing the other, and quite frankly, rhetoric that we wouldn't want to see in our classrooms here at UCL. So these are, by many measures, dire times for disagreeing well. We're certainly disagreeing, but not necessarily disagreeing very well. So against this backdrop, our esteemed panelists here, they're going to reflect upon recent geopolitical crises and challenges, and of course there are many of them. And they're going to think about the effectiveness of diplomacy, of international institutions like the United Nations, which is turning 80 years this year, and International Criminal Court in mitigating and preventing global crisis. Now, let me introduce our speakers, beginning here with Veronica Fikfak, who is professor in international law and human rights here at UCL. She's also the co-director of UCL's Institute for Human Rights and serves as an ad hoc judge at the European Court of Human Rights. We also have with us Miguel Berger, who is the German ambassador to the United Kingdom. He is a former state secretary of the Federal Foreign Office in Germany and a former deputy director of Germany's permanent mission to the United Nations. And we will also momentarily have with us Helen Clark, who is a former Prime Minister of New Zealand, former administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, and currently a president of Chatham House, the International Affairs think tank. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. Now, perhaps to get us started, diplomacy is, of course, is really about disagreeing well. Reflecting on your own experience, would you say that these are particularly dire times for diplomacy? And if so, what has changed? Like, why? Would you like to start?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And I think it's good to have this kind of discussion today. Personally, when I grew up, we had two certainties in Germany. Number one was a strong and growing European Union, and number two was a strong NATO and transatlantic relationship. And now we are facing a situation where this transatlantic bond is not as strong as it was in the past. And within our countries, within the European Union, we are losing unity because of the growing influence of populist and nationalist movements. So we have a challenge from the inside and we have a challenge from the outside. And I mean, you have given the figures. What really concerns me is the challenge to the rules-based international order. And if we look, I have served twice at the United Nations. And if we look at the situation right now, many countries cutting their development aid, cutting their humanitarian aid. The UN currently in their 80th anniversary, really in a very deep crisis, looking at savings and cutting measures. So I think we are really in a very difficult situation where we need to cooperate and where we need to really strengthen diplomacy. And it's really good to talk about that.
Thank you.
So I will answer that question as a lawyer because I'm not a diplomat. So these times, I'd say the last 5 years have been, on a certain level, the busiest years for lawyers, for international lawyers. And in terms of, lawyers getting paid, they've been wonderful. So it's been a good time. What's been really interesting is that in a moment where international institutions, the UN Security Council, have become deadlocked, that what countries have decided to do instead of to sort of break the deadlock or to find some sort of answers is they've turned to international courts. And we're seeing more and more countries appear in front of the International Court of Justice. You've got South Africa versus Israel, where it's not only a dispute between two countries, but where you've got a number of states intervening to say which side of the dispute they're on. You've got a number of advisory opinions, which didn't used to be the case. I used to work at the ICJ 15 years ago, and at the time we had one advisory opinion, and that was on Kosovo independence. Today, the court has never been this busy. And what's interesting about it is that in this moment where diplomacy is, or where Security Council is deadlocked, where diplomacy is hard, states want to be seen, and they want to be seen on the right side of history. They want to have the Instagram moment in the ICJ and say, this is what we've argued. And I'm seeing this, for example, in Slovenia. There's now a debate. Are we going to intervene? I'm Slovenian, I should say. I'm seeing how, the government is discussing, should we intervene? Should we be seen to intervene? And what do we want to say? And I think what the courts have done, what these proceedings have done, they've also given small states, which are usually, I don't want to say irrelevant, but they don't have the same say in the Security Council. They don't have the veto. They're not like permanent members. They can, often be ignored. They've given them a voice, and countries can be seen, and they want to be seen. So I think for international lawyers, this moment is a very different moment that I think nobody expected. And that doesn't only relate to, South Africa, Israel, it doesn't Ukraine and Russia, but also in terms of climate change. So all of these areas where we're struggling to get an agreement between countries are ending up in front of courts.
I mean, you've spoken about the importance of international unity, and then you also mentioned the deadlock that we look in the Security Council of the United Nations. And let's perhaps talk a bit about the Security Council. Is the Security Council still fit for purpose?
I would say no, it's not fit for purpose. Why? Because it was built after the Second World War and based on the geopolitical situation of 1945. And for example, 70% of the cases which are dealt by the Security Council are in Africa. And you have no African member permanently in the UN Security Council. You can argue the same for Latin America. And what we need is really a reform which reflects the variety and the geopolitical reality of today. But the hurdles are so high, and the possibilities of the 5 permanent members to block any progress, that we will live in the foreseeable future with the UN Security Council that regrettably doesn't have the legitimacy it should have.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring Helen Clark out, who is joining us. Everyone, Helen Clark. So thank you, Helen, for joining us. Helen, you have worked in the UN system as administrator of the United Nations Development Program. I don't know if you would like to comment on the role of the Security Council in this time we're living in.
Well, sorry to be late, and I'm doing a quick change in focus from talking about drug consumption rooms in Glasgow to more ethereal matters of a global kind. But I'd love to come in on the first question, though, because are these particularly dire times for diplomacy? Yes, they are, and I think that's been also the conclusion of my colleagues on the panel, one a diplomat, one an international lawyer. I am neither, which doesn't mean I'm not diplomatic. But I think what stands out to me as a huge difference really is the widespread disregard for international law now, and that deeply worries me. Also the chaos and unpredictability. I think the election last year in the United States turned international relations on its head. Old certainties became uncertainties. And then sort of linked to the chaos and the lack of respect for international law, this use of tariffs as an instrument of foreign policy, again, ignoring every sort of trade rule and agreement really ever invented through the GATT round of the WTO or what replaced the NAFTA agreement. So it's a time of just enormous turbulence and unpredictability, and actually calls for diplomatic skills more than ever. But it's a hard environment. But then I know you're going to the second question around the Security Council, and let me agree with what our German colleague just said. Look, on the positive side, the Pact for the Future, which was agreed at the Summit for the Future in September last year at the General Assembly, did call for a consolidated proposal on Security Council reform to be presented to the General Assembly. And there was a quite energetic duo of the Austrian permanent rep to the UN and the Kuwaiti, and it was their job to produce the consolidated proposal. Unfortunately, the Austrian permanent representative's now been redeployed, but a consolidated proposal needs to come that probably no one will agree with all of it, but then they will need to start narrowing down differences. And it's not impossible eventually to get to a situation where the permanent five opposition will be worn down. This happened with the last round of Security Council expansion, which was quite a long time ago. So clearly it needs to deal with the representational issue, because a permanent five, based on who were perceived to be the winners of World War II, that doesn't cut it anymore. And so some kind of new semi-permanent, regionally elected, non-veto wielding new members seems one likely outcome. And then there's other low-hanging fruit which might make the Security Council more effective if this could be agreed within the Council itself, like the French-Mexican proposal, which says that the veto should not be exercised as part of a code of conduct where there's a threat of genocide or mass atrocities. Hello, rather a few. And then there's also that article which hasn't been enforced, Article 27.3 of the Charter, that says that members are not expected to vote on matters in which they're directly involved. Hello. So, if we could keep to the Charter and some far-sighted proposals like the French-Mexican one, we might have a chance of being more relevant as well.
Good. Good.
So the UN Security Council clearly in need of reform, and lots of good ideas for that here. Now, Veronica, you were talking earlier on about the role of the courts. Do you want to say a bit more about the role of the courts in this landscape that we're facing now, particularly about the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the courts as a tool of diplomacy? Are they a tool? Are they a tool of diplomacy? Are they a help for diplomacy? Are they a hinder for diplomacy?
I mean, in some sense, I would say that, international law often provides a sort of I'd say a starting point for negotiations, for diplomacy. So it effectively serves to map out, the status quo. So in the, for example, Russia-Ukraine situation, you've got the Russian invasion, illegal use of force. And that should then bring to a certain, kind of a reflection, a recognition of an illegal attack, reparations from the side of Russia. So I'd say that in peace negotiations, that should be the starting point. And when we look at then kind of a comment made by US President a few months ago, where he suggested that the Ukraine started the war and that it should give up Crimea, that for me, in a situation where Russia is the one that has taken control, is you're kind of gobsmacked as an international lawyer, how that is flipped around. And so I think international law is important for diplomacy when you stick to it, when you uphold it, because it provides this language, but it also provides a starting point. Where the courts step in is, I wonder if at the moment, because we've got these institutions that are deadlocked, we expect too much of courts, right? So the states have taken these questions of genocide, of, UNRWA, climate change, they've taken them to courts, but courts work with evidence, they work with arguments, they work with words and interpretation. And so there are limits to what courts can actually do and what they can say. When you've got the ICC, the International Criminal Court, yes, it can issue an arrest warrant, but it might never get hold of that person, and therefore there might never be proceedings against that person. When it gets to the ICJ, what is the evidence that's going to be presented, for example, in the South Africa Israel case, to show whether genocide has occurred or not, or is occurring, right? And these are important elements that limit of what the court will be able to decide and what not. And so if we wait for these courts to render a decision, which always take years to take place, right? We're going to be waiting a long time, but also we might not get the answer, or the answer might be limited. It might be nuanced. It might be conditional. So I think courts complement, but they decide only the legal questions based on the legal arguments and the evidence presented. They don't provide a resolution.
Miguel or Helen, do you and your experiences have shared these thoughts on the role of the courts that Veronica laid out?
Well, look, I think that the courts at the very least can shine a light on very important issues. And I think we're seeing that with the International Court of Justice. You know, on the key question before them, they're probably maybe even years away from a determination, but it has shone a light and enabled a debate to take place about the severity of what is happening in the Gaza catastrophe, shall we say. So with the International Criminal Court, it does struggle. It struggles to get cases before a court. As you say, some of the arrest warrants may never be carried out. But again, I think that message that there should be no impunity for senior figures committing war crimes, alleged war crimes, or crimes against humanity is very, very important. At the very least, it restricts the movements of such people. But occasionally you do get a conviction. You know, to think of another case that's gone to The Hague, the former president of the Philippines, on cases of charges related to the extrajudicial killings in that country of people he deemed to be targets in his, quote, war on drugs. You know, it's a very important signal that there's not impunity for that kind of campaign. So all in all, I think the moral authority of the court, the integrity of the process, all of this has to be upheld as important.
Well, Miguel, did you want to chip in on this?
No, I can only add to that, and for us in Germany, obviously, if we take that the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War on the Nazi atrocities were one of the starting points of that development. So for us, the question of upholding international law is absolutely fundamental. But we see with the ICC that it is now under pressure. For example, that the US has taken measures against 4 judges, that there is in the US Senate a resolution which, if it comes through, would maybe threaten the existence of the court. And this has reached a level which is very, very concerning. While on the other side, a group of countries, we found that, for example, in the case of Russia's war against Ukraine, there is one very important element missing in the Rome Statute, and that's the crime of aggression. And so the debate which has started now and which we are supporting is, can we convince those who have signed up to the Rome Statute to include the crime of aggression into the statute? But it will be an uphill battle before that becomes reality. But it's, as I said, absolutely fundamental to support the courts and to uphold international law.
Just building on those comments, I think the sanctions against key figures in the International Criminal Court are extremely worrying. And as you say, they're very widely drawn so that, as I understand it, anyone who gives what is deemed to be any material assistance to the court can then be, in some way, secondary sanctioned. So if, for example, you're approached by the prosecutor to assist with the compilation of evidence, does that then mean that the United States administration will go after you or your organization? This is quite a sweeping a sanction. So that's of concern.
Now, sanctions, of course, have become a growing or increasing tool or diplomatic tool. So, for example, in the last 10 years, even though we've seen more and more conflicts, we have not seen any new UN peacekeeping missions, but we've seen a growth in sanctions. What is the appeal sanctions as a diplomatic tool, and what are the conditions under which these can be effective tools? I don't know, Miguel or Helen, you were the one who mentioned sanctions.
Well, I think, I've sort of put on a hat as a Prime Minister. Sometimes you're looking at events which are such an egregious breach of the rule of law internationally, and your public is screaming at you to do something, and you do something. And I think back to when there was, the latest in a series of coups in Fiji, and for New Zealand to have done nothing would not have been tenable. We had a not insignificant Fiji diaspora population. We had a lot of people who followed the events very closely. We were concerned about the breakdown of the rule of law, and we did impose sanctions. From recollection, also stopped the bilateral aid flow that went through the Fiji government. I often think back on it and think, did that achieve anything? But then not to have done anything was not really tenable either. We kept aid going to NGO level, but not through the government. I think looking at the situation now, unilateral sanctions imposed for the most part by Western countries, they haven't brought Russia to its knees. Would they ever realistically have done so? I think where they have more encompassing effect is the secondary sanctions again, that the threat that if you are deemed to be doing something that helps Russia get around a sanction on a supply of a certain kind of material, then you are fair game too. And that causes a lot of countries to tread quite warily. But I think what those of us who live in Western countries need to be very mindful of is that, there are plenty of friends of those who are being sanctioned who don't buy into the sanctions. And so the country sanctioned will continue to be able to trade and go about its business, not the way it was, but to a certain extent. So the chances of getting, sanctions put on by the UN when superpowers are involved, or either as proxies or directly, are pretty remote. So overall, I'm a bit dubious about the impact. But again, publics are saying, what are you going to do about it? And the sanction tool is often one that will be used.
No, I would agree. And, I think sanctions have been used more and more in international politics. So if you look back 15, 20 years, we didn't have as much as economic sanctions as we have now. And regrettably, because we talked about the Security Council would be the right place. For example, in the past, there were unanimous sanctions regimes on countries, for example, on Iran, on others. But now, with the blocked Security Council, it is no longer possible. And that's why Western countries, the European Union, the United Kingdom, we work together in order to impact. And I agree with you. We didn't have as much impact as we thought. But on the other side, we definitely have had and slowed down Russia's war machine in Ukraine through our oil price cap and through many other economic sanctions. But the reality of the world is that we are no longer in a situation like 20, 30 years ago, where the Western dominance in international finance, in the international economic system is so big that our sanctions can really have an immediate effect on the rest of the world. And this is also one of the lessons we have seen from the sanctions against Russia. But we have other examples where sanctions have had effect. So I'm sure that we would never have achieved a nuclear agreement with Iran in the first place without putting pressure. And there are many other cases where sanctions alone, and I think this is really an important point, sanctions alone are not a solution. Sanctions plus diplomacy, sanctions plus a political strategy, only then you can achieve something.
Yeah. From the legal perspective, so what's happened recently is, and this is in relation to Russia, is that sanctions haven't only been interstate, but they've actually targeted specific individuals, right? So, but recently, for the first time with Magnitsky Act and others, oligarchs and political leaders or people who are close to political leaders have been specifically sanctioned. And what's happened is that their assets have been frozen and seized. The problem, though, and in some sense, you would think that would be very effective. So those are called targeted sanctions. The problem with those is that they usually target people who have enough resources to pursue and dispute those sanctions through courts. And there are, we are in 2025. The invasion took place in 2022. For example, in Canada, in 2022, seized the plane. And the plane has sat for 3 years in an airport. And it is only in this May that Canada has launched and has been able to launch proceedings to ask for that property to be forfeited. So it takes a long time to acquire actually what you've frozen, what you've blocked. The Abramovich example here in the UK, where he was persuaded to sell Chelsea. And in that contract, he agreed to put the monies from the sale to the victims of the Ukraine and Russia war. But the wording of the contract says victims of the Ukraine and Russia war. Now, the UK government expects that to go only to Ukraine, only for reparations to Ukraine, and only to Ukrainian victims. So that's still 3 years later an open dispute. So even targeted sanctions that look like they might be more effective because they target a specific individual that's close to the regime, the efficiency there is questionable, or at least it takes a long time.
So we talked about international institutions, we talked about sanctions, we talked about courts. Now, what about private actors in this? So the new aid distribution system in Gaza, which is run by a private security contractors or a private organization backed by Israel and the US, has been criticized by UN agencies, by humanitarian organizations. But what does it tell us about diplomacy today? That it is not the UN that is in charge of humanitarian delivery in Gaza. It's a private actor. What does that tell us?
Well, I think probably just about every member state at the UN thinks the UN agency should be delivering the aid, but there's two that don't. And they happen to be the ones making the decisions. And the quote aid distribution, it's an oxymoron really, which sees hundreds of people killed trying to access food. I mean, and the distribution on the ground seems to be policed by militias, people with very dubious records, things we'd never heard about UN aid distribution. So I think we can't just say it's the weakness of the UN. It is weak. We can't just say it's their weakness, which means their agencies aren't able to deliver. It's the fact that 2 member states refuse to let them deliver. And the consequences are quite catastrophic.
Miguel, do you have?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think the situation we see with everyday people getting killed when they try to get necessary medicine and food is absolutely unacceptable. And it is a deliberate attempt to get the United Nations and the United Nations system out of Gaza. And the UN has all the structures in Gaza. It can deliver help. It has the necessary staff there. But the political intention is to reduce the role of the United Nations. And we are very, very worried about the situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, when I think of diplomacy, I have this vision of meetings that are happening by professional diplomats, behind closed doors, long negotiations, building up relationships over time. And recent negotiations, so we might think about over the war in Ukraine, Iran, Israel, Gaza have unfolded publicly under intense social media and media scrutiny, or almost even on social media. You're seeing announcement, particularly by the American president. How has this public and, in some ways, performative aspect of diplomacy affected the ability to disagree well that this campaign is about?
I think it makes it harder for the diplomats who might have to walk back leaders' comments without leaders taking offence at it. It seems to me that there is a lot more traditional diplomacy going on than meets the eye, and that's because it normally isn't in the public eye. You know, if you think of diplomatic successes this year, and there have been a couple, one was the agreement of the main text of the pandemic accord. Mm-hmm. Now, that was reached through diplomatic negotiation, but there was a lot of behind-the-scenes facilitation. And, you know, a shout-out to the International Peace Institute on the corner of, is it 45th and 1st Avenue in New York, who facilitated behind-the-scenes retreats with key negotiators over many months to try and build a better understanding than was emerging out of the formal sessions. So, you know, this did, in the end, I think, help create an atmosphere where an agreement could be reached. Somehow or another, agreement was reached on the outcome document of the Financing for Development conference that's been held in Sevilla earlier this week. I mean, it's fair to say that in both those processes, the US eventually absented itself. And so agreement was reached without the US, which is unfortunate because we like the US to come to the party in agreements. But, you know, the diplomacy is going on more than we think. You know, for example, even though we hear a lot from President Trump about a lot of issues, you know, behind the scenes he has a Mr. Witkoff who is doing quite a lot of talking, and we don't see the details of all of that all over the news media. There were 5 rounds with a sixth promised of talks with Iran. Whether we can get back to that, heaven knows. I hope we can, because you know that is the way forward on the Iranian nuclear issue, to keep talking. So I don't think we should give up on traditional diplomacy just because we have some rather noisy leaders out there.
Glad to hear that. But we're going to move to audience questions soon, but before we do that, maybe all of you, if you can think of from your own career or experience, are there moments when disagreeing well made a difference, or a time when diplomacy failed precisely because people couldn't or wouldn't disagree well?
Yeah, to take a current example, you know, when we see the situation now, the attacks on Iran, I obviously, and many colleagues in Germany, think about the nuclear agreement we had reached with Iran in 2015, which had taken years of very detailed negotiations. And I must say, for us, in Germany, but I'm sure the same feeling in the United Kingdom, in France, and we did that with Russia, with China at the table. This was, for me, really a prime example of what diplomacy can achieve in very complex and difficult circumstances. And then, as we know, regrettably, Donald Trump walked away from it in 2018. And I would say if that would not have happened, we would be today in a totally different situation. So regrettably, you know, when you walk away from something that was agreed in years of work, it's very difficult to repair that. And when I see Mr. Witkoff dealing with 3 topics at the same time, you know, he's dealing with Iran, he's dealing with Middle East, he's dealing with Ukraine. Each topic in itself would require a big team of expertise and international cooperation and working with allies in Europe, in the world. And that is only partially happening.
Veronica,
so I'll answer that question as an academic, and I really want to underline that to the present time for us, for international lawyers, academics, it is really tough. I'm happy to be in the UK, but I have colleagues in the US who, for example, currently who are in universities who have to teach international law to their students and who come into class and are essentially unable to give a lecture on genocide. They're unable within that lecture to speak about the present situation and whether that situation fulfills, let's say, the criteria. And I've asked these colleagues, so how do you, genocide is one of the crimes, international crimes, and it is what we teach as part of international law on our students. And I said, so how do you teach this issue that is currently constantly in the news? And they teach it on the basis of what happened in 1994. So we're talking about Bosnia, right? Because we have a decision of the International Court of Justice from then. And so it's a really interesting moment for universities, for academic freedom, but it's a really troubling moment, I would say, also of coming into a classroom and knowing that you can't say specific things because of an administration or because of a specific political view. And so I mean, I am very lucky. And I've got great students who want to learn about this, and I'm able to do so. But I know a lot of my colleagues, and this is our bread and butter. This is what we do. This is what we practice. But a number of them are unable to do so and to disagree well and to teach students how to think about these topics. Helen.
Yes, no, I have an example where eventually, after many years, the agreement was to disagree well. Now, those of you, maybe some, in the audience who follow New Zealand foreign policy may recall that in 1986, New Zealand was ejected from the ANZUS alliance with the United States because we had a nuclear-free policy, which was insisting that we know whether or not there were nuclear weapons on vessels coming into New Zealand ports. And that ran up against the neither confirm nor deny policy of the United States. And eventually there was a meeting between the Secretary of State and our Prime Minister, David Lange, where George Shultz memorably said, we part as friends, but we part. Well, fine, life went on, trade kept going, but New Zealand was put in a bit of a dog box. And unlike any other Western country, it didn't have annual consultations. To be honest, I don't really think it affected the intelligence flow that much. But then, having been minister in that area and seen the, quote, intelligence in the lead up to the Iraq War, I don't think it was a great loss if we did miss some things. So anyway, so this sort of simmered on for years and years and years. And literally 30 years later, around 2005, officials came to me and they said, look, there is a bit of a feeling in the US that perhaps it's all gone on a bit long and gone too far. And I said, well, we know that because every time a New Zealander official presented themselves in Washington, the first thing on the agenda was, we don't like your nuclear-free policy. And we never got past that. It was like the roadblock on the road. Every meeting started with a roadblock and you never got past it. So there was a feeling that it needed to be got past. So I said, okay, well, feel free to start discussions around this. And eventually it led to, I was told that as an APEC summit, I would be expected to have a, quote, a pull-aside with the US president. I mean, New Zealand's too insignificant to get a bilateral with the US president at an APEC, but you could have a pull-aside at the morning tea break. So at the appointed time, I approached my American counterpart, who I'd got to know over a number of APEC summits. And I said, look, we're due to discuss whether we could move forward on the New Zealand-US relationship. And when he said to me, can you remind me what it was we fell out over? I knew we'd get past the roadblock. And we did. And so we agreed to disagree. Eventually, it was agreed, look, they're not going to raise it as the first thing. We'll respond and raise somewhere in the meeting, but we're going to get on with life and with a better, a more conventional diplomatic relationship. So, in the end, it was an agree to disagree well. And I think, but it took over 30 years.
Wow.
We need to have the long-term perspective.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much to our panel for this part of the discussion. Now it's over to you, and you can see how you're submitting questions here behind us on the screen. I know we've already had questions trickling in, but while you think more about your questions, we have one expert member, or we have a couple of experts in the audience who would like to ask a question. The first is from Gillian Dare, who is chair of the Board of Trustees of Beyond Conflict and a retired diplomat who has many years' experience in various parts of the world. Gillian, I can't actually see up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. I think we've agreed that traditional diplomacy does work in certain circumstances, but with the increasing number of conflicts, not between state parties, but between armed and non-armed, non-state actors, many of them organized crime people, and many of them prescribed by all of us. How do we bring all those people into negotiating a settlement and a resolution? Can we devolve more to regional organizations? Can we devolve more, perhaps even to the academic world, to bring parties together who we as countries and states can't actually even talk to at this moment? So I'd be interested in your views on that. Thank you.
Okay, we will.
Some of the non-state actors, of course, have countries contributing to the ferment. And we see that in Sudan today, and it's extremely troubling. But it's obviously not the only example by far. I think where a state is struggling with a civil war with non-state actors, there are clear cases where countries can offer good officers to resolve these issues. I mean, I think a very local example in the South Pacific, New Zealand took the initiative in the late 1990s to bring the Papua New Guinea government together with the Bougainville breakaway administration, major province in Papua New Guinea, to bring to an end a devastating civil war, actually, in Bougainville. It's not that well known by most people, but it had to end. And when New Zealand broke the ice and got people in one room in a retreat format at the Burnham military camp outside Christchurch, eventually then Australia came to the party, the diplomacy started, and there was a agreement on a way forward, and the fighting stopped, which was positive. If you think, for example, of the way in which the major civil war conflict in Colombia ended, it was Cuba that provided the host country for the talks, because that's who the FARC had faith in. And Juan Manuel Santos, as president, was a big enough man to say, if that's where they're going to talk, that's where we'll go. And they, ended half a century of conflict with Cuba as an actor. So I think there will be those other countries who can relate to non-state actors who could play a useful role. At the moment, we see some countries playing very unuseful and unconstructive roles, but there is a flip side where it's positive.
Miguel, did you have?
Yeah, I can only add to that I think we have a number of instruments. You know that we have mediation efforts also. It can be the church, it can be NGOs, which can be helpful. So, for example, I remember when we started the discussions in Doha with the Taliban, we had the help of a political foundation who helped, to bridge and establish first contacts. We have the possibility to ask former diplomats or former politicians to talk to people we as a government could not talk directly. And I think we have really a broad variety of diplomatic instruments we can use. The majority of them are not publicly visible, but they are very effective in order to move things in a good direction. Great. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm going to go to our first audience questions. There are lots of really good questions here. And as you know, you can vote on the questions that you want us to ask. So I'm going to read this question just as it's posed. Power isn't just with heads of state. It's with the CEOs of large controlling companies, for example, Meta. How can we ensure they are kept in check? Small question to tackle here. Any takers?
No.
I teach regulating internet giants. And at the end of the course, we come to the conclusion that somewhere a few years ago, maybe in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, states have decided not to regulate them, and now they're too big to regulate them. So the takeaway of the course is that the only hope is the EU, because EU tries and regulates them and sues them. But I think even that is becoming tricky. I think it's very difficult with Meta, with the big internet giants. They've become so big that they're actually part of negotiations on how to regulate them. They've got big lobby groups, and they're also very close to the political kind of circles, right? So we talk about the revolving door. For example, in the Obama administration, after they left, a lot of people who had worked within the administration left and went to work for the tech giants. The same with subsequent, right? So actually the link between politics and technology is very close, and the technology has been very US-centered, and US law actually helped these companies grow big and remain unregulated. I think that's changing a bit. I think there is now a push, and there is concern about how much power they have gathered and how we can regulate them. So there are proposals, to break them up, or at least to limit what they can do. There are proposals on how to regulate content, things like that. So there are movements, but we're very slow, and they're much faster.
Yeah, we do look to the EU, but then the EU, if it does it in a way that offends the US administration, is going to find that used in tariff wars or whatever. So that's quite troubling. On the other hand, as you say, in the US itself, it's entirely possible that if the tech oligarchs fought up with the administration, that you will have then the regulatory machine come down to try to break them up. I mean, look at the span of Facebook across WhatsApp, Instagram, heaven knows what else. But I must say it was a chilling sight to watch the images from the US presidential inauguration and see the tech oligarchs lined up behind, like front row. And that perhaps tells us that unless there's a serious falling out with the administration, they're going to get a lot of protection against other jurisdictions like the European Union.
Yeah, let me very briefly add, yes, I mean, we have a regulation in the European Union, Digital Services Act. The real problem is, as you have said, the size of these companies, the power they have, and that they will have the support of the US president. And we will see very soon, with measures we are going to take in the European Union, what the reaction will be. In the case of Germany, when we had our elections some months ago, we had people like Elon Musk trying to interfere in the German elections. He is free to have his opinion, but where it crosses a line is when the algorithms are manipulated in a way that certain political messages are supported or conspiracy theories are supported. And the European Commission is currently having an investigation on that. But then we come back to the question of the power. We obviously know that whenever there is a decision, they will have an army of lawyers fighting back against that. So maybe they are already too big to fight back. It's a very serious problem in our way, in our perception.
And the question is, has the train already, because it's a run train.
Yeah.
We have another expert with us in the audience, Octavia Perales Sanchez, who is head of international cooperation at the Embassy of Mexico in the UK. Let's go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for this fascinating and timely discussion. So my question echoes some of the things that were already commented, especially, of course, about the role of diplomats. Diplomats are often tasked with maintaining dialogue, even when trust has broken down or domestic politics narrow the diplomatic space. In a current age of rising populism and information warfare, my first question would be, what is the role that diplomats should have or play in defending the long game of diplomacy? And how can they adapt to remain credible interlocutors without becoming politically irrelevant or sidelined?
Small question then.
We should put it to the diplomat first.
No, so diplomacy has definitely changed in times of social media, no doubt about it. And we haven't even talked about the increasing role of NGOs, of civil society in foreign policy. So if I look back at how diplomacy took place 20, 30 years ago, and now it's fundamentally different. And that means diplomacy, foreign ministries have to adapt, have to change. For example, we have to communicate much, much more with public opinion than we would have done 15, 20 years ago. So diplomacy changes and has to adapt to the new realities. But I think that diplomacy will always be needed because there is no other way of solving challenges. And I would really commend the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, the way she has managed a very challenging situation with the US has been a remarkable, for me, example of public and private diplomacy.
I think, we see diplomats now engaging on social media, often those in a bilateral context, talking about, what they're doing, representing their country. And I think this is good. It opens up, diplomatic work to a wider audience. But I think, behind the scenes, there's still, some really incredible relationships that form between diplomats from very different political systems and backgrounds where they can, treat each other with respect, know what their boundaries are, but, be able to do their job. What is very interesting reading in this respect is the Samantha Power biography, where she talks about the relationship she was able to develop with the Russian ambassador, who was a very good diplomat in New York. And he and Samantha, she invited him home for Thanksgiving. Who would have thought of that, that this would happen in New York? But it happened. And she wrote about how, the late ambassador, because sadly he died not so long after the book was published even, but he would say to her, I really can't go further than this. And she was sometimes left with the feeling that if he'd been making the call, he would have gone further, but he was very professional. He knew his boundaries. So, behind the scenes, I think we still see, some really high quality diplomatic work and engagement where people do what they can to try and get to an agreement that might not get there, but it may not be because of best efforts weren't made.
And the perspective from the legal perspective, Veronica?
I think what I'd say is, in terms of the public, how one presents publicly, I think a commitment to international law must be a key part of that positioning. And I think this last year, or I'll say the last few months, have been a real concern in our area of the rejection of international law as a language that we use to communicate, both in diplomacy and in law. and as a tool, right? So it feels very as though there was an earthquake and we're finding our way. And so I think that unquestionable commitment to international rules and international legal order, I think that's sort of a prerequisite.
Now, I'm going to go to the audience questions again, and this is a perfect follow-up to what you just said. So I should say the audience questions have been closed because we've gotten so many of them, but you can still vote on your favorite questions, and then I get to see the top-rated ones. And so I'm going to read this one that has many votes out as it's written. If international law is important to uphold, are you concerned by the lack of outcry by Germany, France, UK, and others against the US recent strikes on Iran? Anyone? The German ambassador?
Wonderful. No, thank you for that question. Yeah, so I would say we are there really in a gray zone. Really in a gray zone because obviously, Iran has developed, since the US went out of the nuclear agreement, a stockpile of uranium which cannot be explained by civilian use. 400 kilogram enriched to 60%, only really weeks away of the necessary enrichment that is necessary for a nuclear weapon. Nobody knows how far they were building the necessary missiles. So, in plus the threat Iran has posed for Israel in the region supporting terrorist groups, that a country like Israel felt absolutely threatened if every year the Iranian leadership says our key objective is to destroy, they don't name it even Israel, they say the Zionist entity. The question is obviously to use Article 51 self-defense means that there needs to be an imminent threat. And I said gray zone because in the end, and that's why neither the British government nor the German or others have taken a definite position, because it's very difficult for us to have a serious assessment how far Iran has really got in developing a nuclear weapon. It could have been weeks away, it could have been months away. And for us, that was convincing enough to say we understand that this was an act of self-defense. And here I would say the German government was more understanding towards the actions of Israel and the US than maybe some others. But this was the difficult analysis all of us had to make and the very difficult judgment we had to take.
Mm-hmm.
So, to respectfully disagree. I'm a member of the elders, and we issued a statement, and we said we considered it a clear breach of international law because we did not see that the justification for invoking Article 51 of an imminent threat of attack was there at all. We're also mindful that the current Israeli PM has been saying that Iran's on the brink of developing a nuclear weapon for at least the last 20 years. What was different this time was that he got a US president to go along with him. We were extremely concerned about the potential fallout from this because there's, I think, some reason to assume that at least some of the fissile material was moved. Now, if Iran, if the pressure had continued to be applied to the extent that regime change was seriously pursued, and you start to take out layers of Iranian leadership and end up with an entirely failed state with fissile material moving around, then you have the potential for a dirty bomb by who knows what elements not really controlled by any structure. And I understand going back a number of years during the Obama administration, this issue of the possibility of fissile material falling into the wrong hands, not just in this theatre but others, was a huge concern. There was a lot of work done on a nuclear security project around this, which was then disbanded, the project under the first Trump administration. So, potentially a genie could have been let out of the bottle with, quite far-reaching and very, very dangerous consequences. I would say Iran, of course, is its own worst enemy. What I think Israel and the US lent on quite heavily was the somewhat adverse IAEA report, which in effect said they weren't cooperating in showing, why they were doing this, what they were doing, how far they were going, et cetera, et cetera. That, of course, is all unhelpful. But then, bear in mind, the reason we had reports was because Iran is a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel is not. So there's no inspections. So there's not exactly an even-handed approach to this, if I could put it that way. I was actually asked on a television interview, I think the BBC recently, somebody, maybe it was New Zealand TV, did we think that that's because, people were more comfortable with Israel having a nuclear weapon than Iran? And I said, don't even go there. Well, as New Zealanders, we're not comfortable with anyone having a nuclear weapon. And we've campaigned for a nuclear weapon-free world for decades. But I think there's a lot of double standards in all of this debate.
Mm-hmm.
An international lawyer perspective for this question.
I'm also going to disagree. So the UN Charter only allows use of force in case the Security Council authorized, or in case of self-defense. It does not allow a preemptive attack.
Our next question is the perfect follow-up to this question. So I'm going to read it as it's written. Is it fair for countries with nuclear weapons to decide who else can possess them?
That's it.
Any takers? Helen, you worked a lot on non-proliferation.
Yeah, well, I think the question kind of answers itself, doesn't it? And, sadly, despite the non-proliferation regime, not everybody's a party to it. And so other powers have developed a nuclear weapons capacity. I think we're in a really dangerous period on proliferation. And, you follow each year that bulletin of atomic scientists, a clock where the hand moves closer and closer to midnight. I'm very concerned about the disintegration of the arms control infrastructure in Europe, the Intermediate Range Ballistic Missiles Treaty and START and all of that. It's a huge concern that we desperately need diplomacy. And while it's it's a difficult argument to make in the current context, but I'll make it anyway. At some point there will be at least a frozen conflict in Ukraine. I'm not expecting a peace settlement. But then, hey, I'm from the Asia Pacific, where there's been an armistice since 1953 between the DPRK and South Korea. The key thing is really to freeze a conflict and not just give time for people to come back and take another bite. So at the point that the conflict was frozen, could Europe get back to some kind of structured talking again with Russia, as it did with the Soviet Union, to get an arms control infrastructure in place? And it's not going to be easy. Heaven knows after what's happened, it's going to be extremely difficult. But I think there needs to be some longer term thinking, because the ramping up of defence expenditure is going to play havoc with domestic budgets and the capacity of countries to provide the services that their people need. Both sides could bleed each other, really. So we need some strong thinking about that arms control infrastructure as mutual security of some kind. And while I'm on the theme of disarmament, some of the other key arms control non-nuclear treaties are also under threat. We now see at least 5 European countries signalling that they will withdraw from the Landmines Convention, the Ottawa Convention, which was hard fought for. And okay, I realise they're exposed.
Yeah.
But do we really want a world where everyone says, fine, if you're under threat, you put the landmines out again, knowing their potential. So this is a very difficult time for arms control. Needs diplomacy, needs the Mexicos of the world have been so committed to disarmament and diplomacy.
Miguel or Veronica, did you?
Yeah, no. For Germany, after the Second World War, decided not to have nuclear weapons. So we strongly support the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have very clearly warned Iran not to get out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I think one of the key concerns why we worked on this nuclear program with Iran and had this diplomatic process was especially because we were concerned that if Iran would achieve a nuclear weapon, then we would open Pandora's box, and maybe other countries in the region, Saudi Arabia and others, would think of acquiring nuclear weapons. And in such an explosive region, dictatorships or authoritarian countries having nuclear weapons would be a very dangerous place to be. I agree absolutely with Helen. It would be wonderful to rebuild the disarmament infrastructure we had. We have to say that Russia has systematically destroyed it in Europe, systematically breaking one agreement after another. We have seen during Russia's war against Ukraine that there were very deliberate threats against the West to use nuclear weapons. And it was very interesting that it was China who stopped Russia of threatening, because the Chinese were very concerned about this development. And it has more or less stopped now. But to rebuild, even if we would have a ceasefire, to rebuild the trust with a country like Russia after the war, that will take a very, very long time.
Oh, we have many more good questions here. So we're going to, here's the next one. I'm going to read it exactly as it's written. How do you engage in diplomacy with dictators without compromising your principles or ethics?
Want to do that?
These are good questions.
Yeah.
Well, look, I think, the truth is that a lot of the world's political systems don't in any way resemble those of the countries represented by those of us on this panel. And so you do have to, live with difference, quite profound difference. And, this is often an issue that's raised in connection with how do countries relate to China. Mm-hmm. Now, again, with China, you could take the attitude that the first thing you're going to go in and put on the table as a visiting leader is the state of human rights in China, which is not great. Fine. If you do that, you'll never get past any other issue. So I'm sure many Western leaders like I who've been on the visits, the Great Hall of the People and so on, you have a menu of issues that you work through in your engagement, and you will start, we do have shared interests, right? I think sometimes now in diplomacy we're overstating shared values. There are values communities. Yeah. New Zealand is part of generally a values community with the European Union and others. But, there's also shared interests which go far beyond your immediate values community. The existential threats to humanity that climate change represents, the biodiversity threats, what are we going to do about artificial intelligence? What about nuclear disarmament? There's a range of threats where we have a common interest regardless of who is governing who. So we have to be able to engage around issues. We want to engage around trade with major economies, So, we have to find ways of engaging where we can still register differences. And I'm sure other Western leaders in their scripts, like I had you came to the part where you raised concern about repression in Tibet or West China or whatever the issue of the time or ongoing issues were. But it's about, acknowledging that we're working with difference, and that no matter what we may say or think, none of us are going to remake the world's political systems in our own image. So we have to, work very strategically.
Would you like to chip in, or shall I move on to our next questions?
No, we can.
Shall we have some? But thank you. What options are available to stop the massacre in Gaza and provide reparation? What options are available?
What options are available? Yeah, so let me start maybe with that one. The most important thing in our view is to reach a ceasefire and the liberation of the hostages. And what we have been trying to do is, on the one side, generate support and a debate around how can Gaza be governed after this disaster. And there the big question is, how can we generate the necessary support in Israel, where the population has been severely shocked after the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October, and on the other side, get the engagement by the countries in the region. Because being realistic, Israel will only withdraw from the Gaza Strip permanently if there is a governance structure that is solid and that can guarantee security. And that is currently a very, very difficult thing to achieve. It would mean that Hamas would have to hand over the power to the Palestinian Authority. It means that we have to empower the Palestinian Authority to take over that position. And in the end, and this is the question to all of us, are we willing in the United Nations, but especially the Arab countries, to take over responsibility for the security in Gaza? And I would see this as a kind of coalition of the willing or a peacekeeping operation, but it needs the engagement of countries of the region. And so this is number one, because we need to give the people in Gaza the hope that things can get better in the future after this total destruction. The second thing, in our view, where we are also working jointly with the British, with the French government and others, is how can we create the momentum to bring the question of the two-state solution back to the table. And we know that currently there is no majority in Israel to do that. But for us, this is a fundamental principle, and we will continue to push for it. So it's a very complex situation, but the key thing is now really finish this terrible conflict in Gaza, bring humanitarian and medical aid in, and work towards a more stable situation in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a catastrophe, right? It's a catastrophe, and the ceasefire is an absolute priority. And every time you see that there might be a prospect, as there is again, you think, if only. And there's always been a package around it of hostage release, prisoner exchange, and ideally to start a process which will lead somewhere. Now, the Arab plan that Egypt has been forward and promoting is actually quite a good plan. All plans need to be fleshed out. Where they come down on that plan is for a technocratic administration.
Yeah.
I mean, at some point, should there be a multinational force on the border? I don't know. Look, the Egypt-Israel peace agreement could never get a UN peacekeeping force, but it got a multinational force. New Zealand's been in it since the 1980s. I've visited the El Gora camp in the northern Sinai, actually very close to the Rafah border twice. Let's just think laterally. But key thing is try to stop it now, because every day that goes by is more human tragedies. When I was at UNDP, I visited Gaza. We had the responsibility there for quite a lot of infrastructure project commissioning, and I opened a water treatment plant with the Japanese ambassador, and Japan had funded I saw just in the last 2 to 3 weeks, one of the long-serving UNDP engineers involved with these projects, his family compound was bombed and he and 36 family members were killed. I mean, I just can't imagine what it feels like to be a member of a family affected like that. So it just has to stop. But we know who has the power to stop it. And that great power has to act.
On reparations, so you'll hear from the two answers that, that issue is really far in the future. And it's because any question of reparations requires, in some sense, an acknowledgement of the situation and a recognition of the wrongdoing. And so thinking about reparations, even in the context of Ukraine and Russia, right? If it happens, it will be part of a peace agreement in that context. Mm-hmm. And then there will need to be funds made available by the invaders, in that case Russia, to Ukraine to be repaired. So reparations are a really tricky thing that takes years. And in some sense, I don't want to say that they're not a priority because they're super important, but they come after the other things are negotiated. And so they take time and they take money.
Thank you. Let's move on to our next audience question. What is the purpose of diplomatic discussions if leaders like Trump can exploit non-democratic methods to disregard them? How does democracy adapt?
Well, I mean, democracy has to show its resilience or it goes under. Yeah. And you're starting to see some of that resilience, I think, come through in the US. I think the opposition in the US, and there is an opposition, has obviously taken time to find its feet. But hey, a shout out to the minority leader of the House who, when I was in the taxi, had been speaking for 7 hours trying to stop the budget bill. I mean, so I do think there's a structural problem with US democracy, and that is that in the countries that we're from, you have a leader of the opposition. You all know who is leading the opposition, and there's some sort of coherence around that. They don't have that until they have their primaries, and that's not going to be manifested until the election year itself. So, but nonetheless, the US checks and balances system, it's pretty frayed at the moment because of the dominance on the court in both houses of Congress and the White House. But you have the state administrations, that are showing. So, democracy about checks and balances, and the more, the resilience of the system can come to the fore now, the more one can be confident that the US will, survive this very difficult period.
Mm-hmm. But I think it's also important for institutions, right? So what we're seeing with Trump is partly a domestic story, but there's also the international element, right? The attacks on the ICC judges. And it's not a new thing in the sense that we've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in other places, right? Where the autocratic leaders attack independent institutions like courts, like international institutions, the European Court of Human Rights or the EU, right? We've had Brexit, we in the UK are having a discussion about pulling out of the European Convention on Human Rights. Those are all discussions that affect the authority and try to undermine the legitimacy of international independent judicial institutions. They are trying to undermine the authority of judges, right? We've had headlines here in the UK about judges as enemies of the people. And that is part of what, some scholars call the autocratic strategy textbook. So that you've got these tools with which you're going to play to the national audience, be a strong man, and you're going to play in a way that you're going to label something foreign, you're going to attack it. The problem, though, is that it does affect people in those institutions. It does affect judges. It does affect what you render, what kind of a decision you're going to render, and how you're going to be concerned about the reaction of the country later on. So in some sense, yes, the democracy can adapt, but I think we don't want to underestimate the impact that Trump is currently having on international institutions by attacking them.
No.
Yeah, no, I agree on that, and it is very concerning. But on the other side, having lived twice in the US, I'm very confident about the strength of and resilience of the American democracy. And the challenge for us is how to navigate this uncertainty and the disruption, which is constantly created. But it also leads, I would say, us in Europe to a closer cooperation. Mm-hmm. And the fact that we have now, not only bilaterally between Germany and the United Kingdom, but also with the European Union, really a reset in the relationship, I think also has to do with the uncertainty around us. So I think the countries which are democracies, share the same values, need to work together. And, one of the experiences we have in the United Nations is that it's not only us who are worried about these attacks against international institutions. You have many voices in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, who say that this rules-based order is something they also absolutely want to preserve. Because if this is threatened, then we are in a world where 2-3 major powers decide on the fate of everybody else. And that's why many countries in the so-called developing world are very concerned about these developments and are in the United Nations, I would say, our allies in many of these topics.
We have a question that is more about how you use diplomatic skills. I will read it in one's personal life, which I think is a nice way of ending our discussion on disagreeing well. So the question is, what are some diplomatic skills you have learned in your careers which have helped you in your personal lives? And I guess particularly we might think about this in terms of disagreeing well, some skills for disagreeing well. Miguel, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for a diplomat is really to listen to others, to listen and understand where they come from, why they express a certain opinion, why they have a certain interest. And then, as Helen said, you can come to a point where you agree to disagree. But in order to advance and to move things forward, and so I was posted at the United Nations several times, the point of reaching a conclusion, negotiating a resolution, you have to try to take into account where another country comes from and try to find a way forward and middle ground. And I think this is something, this learning to listen to others and understand and try to understand their position is something that definitely also helps in private life.
I was going to answer exactly the same way, that you have to listen, because not everyone sees the world the same way as you and your country do. The countries have very, very different experiences and perspectives. And one of the initiatives I like the best, and I'm sure it runs in the United Kingdom and many countries like New Zealand, but you see senior high school students every year going to a model UN. Mm-hmm. They kind of almost randomly draw out of a ballot who you're going to represent. And if you have to go away and work out, okay, I'm representing Iran in the Model Assembly, and you have to understand their arguments and put them forward. And you may not agree with any of it, but it gets you inside why would they be thinking like this? Why would they be advocating like this? And we have to understand where people are coming from to even get off, first base on the discussion.
Yeah, rational legal perspective on this question.
I would say that we have to listen so that we know how to frame an argument for the state, for the client. So we have to, what a lawyer does is, we don't disagree, we interpret. So I have a different interpretation than you. We don't disagree, but I read this differently. And so you have to, in some sense, listen. But having a different interpretation is always useful in personal relationships.
Well, thank you so much, our panelists. We've touched on some, big topics: Gaza, Iran, nuclear weapons, atrocities, and I think our panels have been models in disagreeing well, as have you with the questions you asked. Our provost, Michael Spence, is going to come to the stage and wrap up the event for us.
Well, it falls to me to... Thank you. It falls to me to offer the vote of thanks on behalf of the university. And listening to the conversation, it seemed to me again and again that we rather expect too much of our diplomats and therefore underestimate what they can achieve, and expect too little of ourselves and therefore again underestimate just exactly what we could achieve. You see, again and again, what we did was say to the diplomats, how are you going to stop war? How are you going to stop chaos? How are you going to stop evil in the hearts of men and women? How are you going to stand there in front of the tanks? Underestimating that again and again, you gave us great examples of times when diplomatic conversations had just shifted the course of history 1 or 2 degrees. And of course, over the arc of history, that 1 or 2 degrees, that limitation on power makes an extraordinary difference. And hats off to you for the remarkable work that you do in the different ways that you participate in the international conversation. And yet we kept letting ourselves off the hook. We never in this conversation admitted that at some level we get the conflicts, we get the political leaders, we get the systems that we deserve. Disagreeing well is not just about them, it's about us practicing the epistemic arts. It's about us listening well. It's about us choosing language commensurate with increasing the goal of understanding. It's about us not demonizing the other. One of the most depressing studies I've read recently was looked at political typologies in the UK. The most educated were the least likely to listen, the least likely to demonstrate that kind of epistemic humility, and the most rigid in their attitude towards the world and other people. And that's part of why we have this program, because we think as culture-shaping institutions, universities have a particular responsibility to build the kind of world that is worthy of the kind of leaders that we've seen on stage today. So look, thank you very much for not giving up believing in the importance of discourse, in the importance of evidence, in the importance of reason, in the importance of listening, and its capacity to make a difference even in the most difficult situations that we currently face. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to ask you to join with me in thanking the panel for what has been really quite an extraordinary afternoon discussion, but particularly too for the ways in which they've contributed to making the world a better place. Thank you. Thank you very much.